All right. So today we're recording this on Sunday, March the 12th, right before the season finale of The Last of Us show. That's came out this year. HBO exclusive show, based on the video game The Last of Us. I haven't watched any of it. I haven't seen any of it at all. I don't have HBO, but I know you have been watching the show, and I've been hearing a lot of really, really good things about the show. So I'm kind of curious. I just wanted to ask you a few questions before this finale. One of them is, how do you feel about this show so far? Do you think it's good? Does it live up to the game? Because I know you've been quite interested in the game and quite a bit of a fan of the game in the past. Does this show live up to what the game kind of pitched and what it did for PlayStation over the past few years? Is this series going to end with the first game? And my third question is going to be, there's going to be a season 2. Do you see this as season 2 is going to be all of Last of Us Part 2, or do you maybe think that that game is going to get split up into multiple seasons? I'm kind of curious just to hear what your thoughts on the series are overall. And do you recommend people watch it?
I definitely recommend people watch it. I think the series has been great overall. Definitely delivered on what the game, I guess, promised or what the game brought or what it offered. Great
Interesting.
series. I'm very much enjoying it. And I don't know if it's officially been said. I think it might have been somewhere, but so each game is going to take 2 seasons. So
Oh,
this first season isn't going to end with the first game.
interesting.
Yeah. At least I'm pretty sure. I could be completely wrong, and maybe they fit a whole lot into this last episode. But yeah, each game will take 2 seasons. So the second season should be the end of the first game. I'm really pretty sure that they would be renewed for 2 more seasons after the second season, so that you could get Last of Us Part One and Part Two. But yeah, just the overall feel of the game, I think, has been very well conveyed in the story of the show. Now, there's some stuff that they can dive deeper into in this show, and the game has a lot more action to it. I mean, it's action adventure, survival type game. So you, as great as the story is, you can't completely keep people interested in a game where it's just all story and there's no action going on, at least for this type of game, right?
Hmm.
So I want that to be known. If you're either someone coming from the game to the show or going from the show to the game has a lot more action than the show does, but the overall story is great in both. I know the actor who played Ellie got a lot of flack, or has gotten a lot of flack. I think she's done an amazing job. I think she's really, in my opinion, I think she's really, you know, shown the essence of Ellie, and it's very difficult because when The Last of Us came out, it was very clear that Ellie was modeled after the actor Ellen Page.
Yeah, yeah.
Very clear, and I think Ellen Page actually sued or tried to sue PlayStation for like, hey, he made this character based off of me. Like, this is clearly me. It even sounds like me. Like, what the hell, PlayStation? So I think for the game to be so clearly based off one person, and then the show to have not that person, but someone who, isn't exactly that person play them, it's a little bit of a disconnect that way. But I think she's done an amazing job. I think they've done an amazing job playing Ellie. Yeah, and I think this show is, I'm very excited for the finale. I think it's done a great job, and I'm very much looking forward to the finale and to the second season coming out. But yeah, are you interested in the show at all? I know you're someone who hasn't played the games, and you said you wouldn't play the games. But yeah, what are your thoughts on, I guess, what you've heard of the show? And once the finale comes out, do you think you'll watch it?
It might be a show that I'll skip. And yeah, I mean, I've played some of the games. I personally find not just The Last of Us, but also Uncharted games to be kind of boring for me in particular. I don't think they're bad games by any means. I just don't personally have a ton of fun playing them. As someone who's like more into things like Western RPGs, like Mass Effect or Skyrim or stuff like that. Those are some of my favorite games of all time. There's much more options in terms of how you play the game and like what you're doing with your characters and stuff like that. And one of my biggest issues with something like The Last of Us. And it's kind of one of the reasons why I brought up this question to begin with. And no spoilers here, but I did not, I didn't hate, but I didn't like the way that game ended, the first game. I thought
Mhm.
the choices were kind of weird and not what I would have done. Had it been like something like, I don't know, an RPG where you got to make your own choices like Mass Effect, would have absolutely not made those choices. So I was kind of curious to see if maybe the show might kind of switch that up or add a little bit more context as to, or maybe more reason as to why choices like that were made. But that's also the world of the universe of The Last of Us. People make really bad and kind of difficult choices all the time to survive in that world. It's kind of one of the main themes of the game to begin with.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's just one of those things, and because of that, also because I know the story of both The Last of Us Part One and The Last of Us Part Two, uh, it doesn't really draw me into to watch this series as much. But and this might be a difficult question for you to answer, but I have talked to some people who have watched the show and maybe do not, well, not maybe, they don't really have much experience with the game. They don't know the game at all. And I found myself having to explain some things to them, like they really didn't understand, for example, who the Fireflies were and stuff like that. And I also noticed that they did the Left Behind kind of storyline
Yeah.
out of order. It was kind of like a flashback. So they didn't really understand what was Ellie's deal and stuff like that. Have you found that maybe this show could be a little bit difficult for people who maybe aren't familiar with the games, or do you think, at least from what you can tell, they kind of explain the story pretty well?
I think they explain the story pretty well, and I actually think to some extent they explain it better than the games
Interesting.
did. Now the Left Behind, is that what it was? Left Behind?
Yeah.
So I never played the Left Behind. I think I read the story of it, so I kind of got the gist of it. But I found it very useful that they threw that sort of as a flashback into the story, and it helped
Hmm.
explain Ellie's story a lot more. It helped explain Ellie's background a lot more. And so that was actually something watching it that it was like, "Oh wow, I didn't fully know this story." So it's something
Hmm.
that was new to me, whereas most of the stuff in the show it's like, "All right, I'm like it was a long time since I played the first Last of Us, but it's like, all right, I know what's going on. I know what's going to happen. There's not too much that's going to surprise me." So when they did that flashback, that's something that, someone who's only familiar with The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2, something that I was surprised by and enjoyed. Same thing with the story of Frank and Bill, right? In the game, they kind of allude to them and you get to meet, I think you meet Frank for a tiny bit. But in the show, they dedicated an entire episode to them. And it's like, these are characters that I'm familiar with on a surface level, but to
Yeah.
dedicate an entire episode to these two characters and that you get to know them and you get attached to them, I think that was very well done too. Where it's also like, all right, someone who's familiar with the games only, you still get something new. You can still be surprised by something. You can still be caught off guard by something, right?
Nice.
So it's one thing that I definitely applaud. And even when it comes to the Fireflies, for instance, right? Like, generally from the game you get an idea of the Fireflies are, but there's one moment and it's another flashback where you go back to Ellie being in school, let's say, in the Fedra school, which is sort of the government at the time. And there's more of a in-depth conversation as to, okay, what is Fedra? What is this government that exists in the show? How does it run? How do they select their leaders? How do they promote people? Which, I mean, from my memory, you don't get in in the game at all. Maybe you could. There's some side quests maybe where you can do some extra research and do some extra curricular activities and you can find out about them and you can find out more about the Fireflies. But as someone once again who's familiar with just the games, I think they've done a good job explaining both Fedra and the Fireflies and giving you new perspectives on characters that you're familiar with or that but being able to go deeper into those characters or those stories. So I think they've done a really great job doing that.
Nice. Well, honestly, that's awesome to hear. I mean, it's one of those shows where once again I've heard a lot of good things about, and I think that was expected. It's HBO. These guys make great shows, and The Last of Us, The Bones of The Last of Us, like you mentioned, is just a great story. Really entertaining story for people who play the game. So yeah, it's one of those things where It's great that they were able to execute so well. I guess my final question. So you already mentioned that you recommend it. Do you think there will be any ways that they can improve? Since it seems like they've improved on the first game with a lot of context. Do you see maybe they'll do the same thing with the second game as well? Maybe improve the context of that game going forward. And are you excited to see a live action version of this show of the second game? Considering the second game was kind of divisive by a lot of people.
I'm very excited. Very excited. As you mentioned briefly, there's a lot of difficult decisions that people make in the game. And I think, especially in a game, like you said, usually RPGs, you get to decide how the story goes a bit.
Mhm.
When you're presented with a difficult decision, you can choose which path you go. And then it's kind of like, all right, everything that happens is a consequence of the decision that I made. On a TV show, you don't get to make any decisions, right? So
Yeah,
you
yeah,
go where the story takes you. So I'm very interested to see the audience's response. I mean, I'm sure there will be something that they end this first season with, but I'm very interested to see the end of the second season and then the end of what would eventually, I guess, be the fourth season, because there's a lot of difficult decisions coming up.
yeah.
And as someone who's playing the game and involved in the story that way, it's a lot. I'm very interested to see, sure there'll be all kinds of memes and all kinds of Twitter threads that pop up about it. I'm sure, for the next week, people are probably going to be talking about the season finale. So, as someone who is a fan of the video games originally, and as we talked about, it's difficult for these game developers to be profitable when you have these games popping up on streaming services where you're getting a tenth, if if that, of what you expected to get.
Yeah.
So, as someone, I guess, who's a fan of Naughty Dog, because I was a fan of the Uncharted games also, right? I'm a fan of The Last of Us, I'm a fan of Naughty Dog, and for them to translate this great selling game into a TV show, I think is only going to bolster that development company, Naughty Dog, and hopefully they keep on producing games of this caliber and producing stories of this caliber. And yeah, I think it's great to see. And I think Halo season 2 is coming out also, now that we're talking about
Really?
video games that have been adapted to TV shows. I could be wrong. I feel like I saw a trailer somewhere, but yeah, I'm a fan of great video games
Yeah.
becoming great TV shows, because great stories are great stories, right? So it
100%.
doesn't matter if it's told through a game, if it's being told from a show, from a movie, from a book. Great stories are great stories. So I'm glad that the story of The Last of Us is able to reach a wider audience. And maybe that means that some people that were never interested in the video game are saying, "Hey, maybe I'll pick this up. Maybe I'll try this out. Maybe I'll, if my friend has a copy, I'll borrow it from them and try and play it."
Well, have you felt the urge to go back into The Last of Us Part 1 because of the show? The
Definitely,
game?
yeah. Definitely.
Yeah.
And I have a friend actually who's been playing along with the story, where it's like, all right, the show comes out and then they play through that part of the game up until the show ends. And then they wait till the next week, and then when that episode comes out, they play up until that point with the game too. So I think that would definitely have like a deeper understanding of it. But there's someone who's played the games multiple times, right? So they're very familiar with the story. My only
Yeah.
thing is, if you aren't familiar with the story, it would be difficult to, let's say, at the end of this first season,
Just stop.
to just stop.
Yeah.
I'm sure that'd be very difficult, because then you definitely get a lot of spoilers for yourself. But I mean, it's a great story, so
Well, speaking of spoilers, and I might cut this out, but I just have one question that I've been asking myself. Do you think there's any actor on the planet right now that could embody Abby?
um,
That you can think of? I mean, obviously there will be someone that can play this role, but anyone that you can think of who could be Abby?
Ronda Rousey.
That's a good one.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I don't think she has that kind of range though, but
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Definitely not, but yeah, that's an interesting question that's been boggling my mind of like who is going to be Abby, maybe in season 3. But yeah,
yeah, yeah, good question. So last week we talked a bit about The Last of Us. It was right before the finale, season 1. I'd say it's pretty spoiler free, right?
yeah,
Also, this is going to be pretty spoiler free too. I don't want to talk about anything that actually happened in the episode. Maybe we'll save that for after the podcast.
Mhm.
But just some of the numbers. The finale had 8.2 million viewers the night of the finale, which is, I think their previous record for an episode was like 7 million. So they broke their own record, which was great. The first 6 episodes of this season are averaging 30.4 million viewers per episode. Episode 1 is getting close to 40 million views if it's not at it already. Season 1, huge success, right? I think even after the second episode, it was already renewed for a second season, which is, I mean, 2 episodes into a show is pretty big deal, I would say. Spoiler alert first. Now, I think in the last episode, I had said that they were planning to split up the games into 2 seasons each. So I didn't think that they were going to end the first season with the first game. So I guess that's a bit of a spoiler. But I didn't think they were going to end the first season with the first game. They did. I mean, great ending, as it was in the game. But it's for the second game, they're going to split up into multiple seasons. So I'm not sure how many seasons they're planning to split it up for. I would assume 2, but they've been renewed for a second season. I would assume that if it does as well as this first season, they would be renewed for a third season. I think it was phenomenally done. I think, last week as we were talking about it, I was very impressed with the season up until the finale. I was very impressed with the finale when it happened too. I talked with a few people who weren't familiar with the story, who never played the games, never watched any play-alongs. So I mean, I was expecting for them to be surprised by the finale. It's a great finale, and I got some joy out of talking with them. Be like, man, I can't believe that happened. I didn't see that coming again. Like, completely blew my mind. Which playing the game, when it happened, I was like, my mind was blown too,
Yeah.
right? So the fact that, and I think I said this last episode, I think we said this last episode, the fact that this is a great story, and now it's not just limited to people who like playing video games or who like playing, suspense or thriller video games. Now everyone is exposed to this great story. I'm very appreciative of that because before this show came out, it was, man, The Last of Us is a great story. I think you like the story, but you're not someone who likes playing video games or likes playing thriller video games. So you're not going to get to experience this. But the
Mhm.
fact that they've made a TV show and now they've brought it out to more people, they've brought it out to the world. I mean, that's something that I really like seeing. Something that's great to see, right? Good stories are good stories. Now, another mild spoiler. So if you don't, I mean, a little bit of a spoiler, but you get a flashback in the finale, like right at the start of it, and you get to see Ellie's mom.
Mm.
What's cool is the actor that played Ellie's mom is the same actor who played Ellie in the original game. Her name is Ashley Johnson. So it's a cool little Easter egg crossover that the person who played Ellie in the game is the one playing Ellie's mom in the show. I mean, she's a bit too grown to play Ellie, but it kind of it makes me think of the Mandalorian, right? Where you have Bo-Katan Kryze who comes in, who's a pretty big character in the Clone Wars TV show, but the actor who plays Bo-Katan in the show is the same person who voiced Bo-Katan in the TV show, or sorry, in the animated Clone Wars show. So it's a nice little Easter egg for people who are fans of the games, fans of the series, which, for someone just watching it, it's okay. This person played Ellie's mom, great. But for people who played the game and who are familiar with the actor's work, it's like, oh, wow, this is incredible that you brought the same person that I'm familiar with into this live action adaptation, right? Which is, I think, a nice little touch to fans, or I guess a nice little homage to fans. But question to you, what have you seen around the finale? What kind of stuff have you heard? I'm assuming it was pretty you've heard positive stuff about the finale. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the first season of The Last of Us?
Yeah. So from someone who hasn't watched it, and I don't know if I will watch it at some point, but despite that, the conversation around the show has been fantastic. And here's the thing: I kind of always figured it would be. I've said many times, maybe off the podcast and maybe even on the podcast, The Last of Us is a game I really don't enjoy playing, but the story is really, really good. It's It's one of those stories that not just for people who love video games, but people who also don't love video games get attached to these characters. And I think that's just goes to show just how good uh, Naughty Dog is at creating characters that people really like. They did the same thing with Uncharted. People really love characters like Drake and all the characters that are in that game, Sully and stuff like that. But the difference is the creators were involved from beginning to end in the creation of this show. Also, a lot of the creators that were involved in the creation of Uncharted aren't with Naughty Dog anymore. People like Amy Hennig. But, Neil Druckmann, one of the figureheads of Naughty Dog and creators of this game series, was involved in the creation of this show from beginning to end. Like you mentioned, Ashley Johnson, who is the voice of Ellie, was involved in the show. And they said from even before the show came out, hey, she's going to be a character in the show. We're not going to tell you who, but she is. Also, Troy Baker, the voice of Joel, was also in the show. Don't know who he played. I haven't watched the show, but and that was always kept a secret. But just that idea of, hey, we know there's a lineage with these games. We know there's fans of these games. We're going to thread the needle of, hey, you know the game. You like your version of Joel and Ellie. We're going to show you that we like them too by bringing the people who played them into the show. And not just make it like a throwaway or an Easter egg. We're actually going to give them parts to play that are actually interesting and integral to the story. So yeah, I 100% think that they hit it out the park with this. And once again, not surprised. I always thought that they would, but also it's just great to see. And I'm as much as I haven't watched the show yet. I am really excited to see what happens, how they adapt The Last of Us Part 2, because that is very, very divisive. It's a game that I watched from beginning to end, for the most part from beginning to end, and I absolutely thought was great. In some ways, I kind of even liked it more than the first one, which I know there's a small minority of people who feel that way, but it's just an interesting kind of way to tell a story, and I don't know. It's definitely going to be much more of a difficult adaptation than the first game. But I am very excited for it. And I think they said it will be at least 2 seasons for the second game. I think the thought of it being 2 makes sense. Whether or not they go longer than that, we'll see. But then there's also going to be a new game that's coming out. It's supposed to come out this year, The Last of Us Factions, which is like an adaptation of if anyone remembers, in the first Last of Us game, there was a multiplayer mode that was based off of the multiplayer mode from the Uncharted games, but just added a few more features into it, kind of grounded it in the Last of Us universe. There's supposed to be a new multiplayer game in that same vein that is supposed to be very story heavy. What that means, I don't know how you make a multiplayer game very story heavy, but maybe that could be something where they adapt into the show as well, maybe extend out to more seasons. But the one thing I think you brought up a good point here. This finale was fantastic, right? People really loved the finale, and it was true to the source material, at least from what it sounds like. You don't want a Game of Thrones situation where you have this really popular show and you either try to shoehorn too much stuff into too little of episodes, which is a lot of the criticism I heard about the last season of the Game of Thrones.
Yep.
And also, you don't want a bad finale that's not based off of source material, because that's another complaint I heard about Game of Thrones. The source material wasn't there. That was just something that the creators made up as they went along. And you don't want to see The Last of Us go down that same path. And I think if they cap it at 3 seasons, hey, this is the core story. This is the story that we're going to tell. Great. End it there. If you want to do something with The Last of Us later on at a later date, go ahead. If they ever make a 3rd game, maybe you can adapt that. But yeah, from my point of view, as someone who hasn't watched the show and likes the games but isn't like the biggest fan, like I'm not clamoring for more Last of Us stuff, I would say I would like them to play it more conservative and just like, okay, this is what we have, this is our end date, we're done with the show, maybe we'll reevaluate it later. But I know you're a much bigger fan of The Last of Us than I am. Would you like to see them be a little bit more open with creating more stuff for The Last of Us, maybe having more seasons that aren't based off of games, or are you afraid that might go down the Game of Thrones path?
I'm definitely afraid that might go down the Game of Thrones path. Yeah, it's difficult. I would definitely like another Last of Us game, and I wasn't aware of the Factions game, to be honest. It's the first time hearing of it. I would like another Last of Us game that follows the main characters. I don't want it to turn into something where it's like, I don't know. I can't even think of like a game series right now, but needs to be a clear ending to it.
Yeah.
I don't want it to be open ended, like the Indiana Jones movies, for instance, right? Where it's like, okay, Indy does this and Indy does that, and oh, Indy, he disappears for a movie, and now he's back again, and oh, he's 60 years old, and he's still running around like a 20-year-old. Like,
Yeah.
great movies, entertaining movies. I'm not mad that there's another Indiana Jones movie coming out. I'm definitely not mad about that. But this game, or this story, I guess, really, because it's not just a game anymore. This is something very separate than that. This is like a distinct story driven experience that needs to have a conclusion, because I'm sure they could keep on just churning out games and churning out stuff, and people would still watch it. I'd still watch it. I'd still play it. But this needs some sort of conclusion, and I want the same people that started the process, that started the story, to finish the story, and then once it's done, that's it. We don't need people piling on top, and we don't need, people coming back when they're 70 years old and, yeah, I still got another run in me. Like, no, give us an end to this story. I'm sure it's going to be a controversial, and I'm sure, people are going to be upset, people are going to be angry, people are going to be crying, but this should have a clear end to it, whether it's a third game, whether it's possibly a fourth game, like, but it needs an end. And I want the show to go on for that, tell the story, and then it's done, right? Like, if you look at other HBO shows, especially, let's say, something like The Sopranos, right? Or something like The Wire. Like, I'm sure with how successful those shows were, they could probably be in like their 15th season by now, right? But it was, no, we have a story, we have a start, we have an end. Once we're done telling it, it's done. And then us as HBO, we're gonna find another story to tell. I think that's what this, and I want to say show, but I think that's what this show, this game, this story, I think that's what this deserves, right? So I hope they come out with another game. I hope they come out with shows that tell the story of the games, and then I hope they finish it and they don't, just keep on trying to stretch it out just because they know they can make more money. I just want them to like do it justice, right?
Well, on that note, I mean, I guess you already gave your answer to this question, but I'll ask you this: can you think of any non-main character, non-Joel, non-Ellie character or group or faction that you would like to see explored in either a Last of Us game or, kind of more interesting to me, a show? Like, I would personally love to see like a really, I don't know about if dark is the word, but kind of like exploratory kind of show on the Scars, the Seraphites,
Mm.
um, and kind of just dig deep into that and be completely separate from what we know from Joel and Ellie and kind of build that up. I would love to see that be like, maybe even if they do 2 seasons of The Last of Us Part 2, there could be the first season, then that season on just going into, the Seraphites, and then the end, the conclusion of The Last of Us Part 2 as maybe a fourth season. If you were going to extend it, I don't think that's necessary, but that's just something I would personally like to see. Is there anything on that level for you that you would like to see? And then also, since this was such an exceptional kind of adaptation, I think a lot of people have faith in video game adaptations, which they should. There's been a lot of really good video game adaptations in the past. This might be the best, but is there any other game that you would love to see the same kind of love and care put into to bring to a TV show that maybe you can introduce to people who wouldn't play games but would probably be interested by the world or the story?
So as soon as you started saying that, I was thinking of, I mean, the two main factions, right? Fedra and the Fireflies.
Mm.
In the show, you get a little bit more behind the curtains look at how Fedra operates. I would really like to see the story of, and you could even do this from like the start of the outbreak. Spoiler alert: this is a show about an outbreak and apocalypse. But I would like to see, okay, how was it founded, and then how did it grow and develop up until the story of The Last of Us, up to the story of Ellie and Joe, and then even the Fireflies. Okay, how did the Fireflies get founded? Who were the first Fireflies? Because I'm sure there'd be an amazing story arc about that,
Hmm.
right? But like, who were the first Fireflies? And then same thing, how do they grow up into the story of The Last of Us, right? the scars would be cool too. Like there's so much in this that they could dive into. And it's clear from how they've done the show that there is still so much more story to tell. Like the episode with Bill and Frank in the game, they're just they're mentioned, right? They're alluded to a bit, but they don't go in depth. And then you get an entire episode going into the lives of these two. And it's like for someone who played the game, and I'm sure for you, for someone who, or I guess no, you never watched the episode, so you don't know. But as someone who played the game, that was something that was brand new to me, and that's what I think I mentioned. Like, I was very pleased to see that there was still more story to tell, right?
Hmm.
And maybe it's like they have all these stories to tell, but it doesn't necessarily fit into the game and the flow of the game. So it's just, stories that they have stored away somewhere. So I'm sure that, when it comes to factions like the Scars, like Fedra, like the Fireflies, they probably have all of that stuff mapped out already. And it's just like, we're not going to fit this into the game because it might take people out of the main story, but we have that source material. So I think personally, I'd be interested in those two factions, and I would love to see a show maybe after they tell the entire story, or maybe like you said, maybe they do the second game, then they go into the backstory of whatever factions, and then they come out with another season. But I'm sorry, what was the second part to your question?
Is there another property, a video game that you would like to see adapted to this kind of level?
I guess one thing I'd be interested in seeing is Red Dead Redemption,
Mm.
but I've never played the games.
Mm.
So, sort of like you to The Last of Us, I'm not really interested in playing it. I I know they're great games. I've heard they're great games, but from the pacing of the games, I just
Yeah.
don't. I'm not interested. Sounds like a great story. Sounds like a lot of fun. Maybe
Yeah.
when I'm retired, maybe then when I have more time, I'll play the games. But I think from what I've heard, great stories, great games. So I'd be interested to see in a live action adaptation of that. Is there anything that you'd be interested in seeing in terms of a game turn it into either a TV show or a movie?
Well, I will say to your point about Red Dead, I think that's an awesome choice. I think very similar to The Last of Us. Those are very story heavy games, and I think they would work really well as being translated. So yeah, that I think that's a great choice. For me, there's definitely game worlds that I would love to see adapted. Not necessarily, I don't think the stories work well in one to one being translated into a TV show, but something like Mass Effect, for example.
I
I
was
think that story,
literally, as soon as you said game worlds, I was like, fuck, Mass Effect.
yeah, it's just one of those things where I don't think the actual story works as a TV show, but the world I think could be really really fun and really really cool, especially if you have the level of care and budgets and. But here's the thing, though: a lot of the people who are involved in the creation of the Last of Us, sorry, in the creation of uh, Mass Effect at BioWare are no longer with the company. So there isn't that level of expertise in there. And also, Mass Effect is a little bit of it's heavily inspired by Star Trek. So it's not as new and as fun and as interesting as something like The Last of Us would be to a lot of people. But then another one, we saw a kind of an adaptation of it would be Cyberpunk 2077. I think that world is fantastic. I think that world is really, really cool. And I think you could do so much more with that. I think Edge Runners was a great start. I still think you could do a lot more. But overall, my winner, and I think they are working on the show. Don't know if I have as much faith in it as I did The Last of Us, but it would be Fallout. I think Fallout is just one of those things where it doesn't need to be the most expensive show, but it's kind of like very similar to The Last of Us in the realm that it's a pseudo kind of horror world. It's very easy to relate to what's going on in that world, similar how it's easy to relate what's going on in The Last of Us, despite the fact that it's a very different world. And I think it would be much easier for larger audience to digest. Unlike something like Cyberpunk and Mass Effect, I think those are going to speak really well, kind of like what Halo tried to do, but speak really well to a gaming audience. I don't think it's really going to bring in people outside of gaming. I think Fallout could bring in people outside of gaming because it's just kind of like a post-apocalyptic, what does the world look like when there's a nuclear fallout kind of a situation, and just how shady that world is. I feel like there's a lot of analogs to to The Last of Us in that kind of situation of like, yeah, you could tell really good, cool stories. But unlike The Last of Us, once again, I don't think you could translate those stories one to one because they're just not at that level.
Yeah. Shout out to Cyberpunk. Yeah. Edge Runners, great show. I think I watched it maybe like at least 3 or 4 times.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Like, and the overall story isn't that long, right? I think it's what, like 9 episodes,
Yeah.
right? But yeah, very enjoyable show. I still haven't played Cyberpunk, but it has me interested in Cyberpunk. And on Netflix right now, I think it's gaining in popularity. The last time I logged into Netflix, it was saying that it's popular. I don't know if it's just popular in Canada right now or just popular in North America or globally, but for whatever reason, it's kind of popping back up. And yeah, very good adaptation coming from someone who's not familiar with the story at all.
Yeah.